Ladies and gentlemen, patriots across the globe, welcome once again to neighborhoodnewsstudio.com. It is Friday, May 6th, and we got a great lineup ahead of us today. We got Mr. John O'Loughlin, McDuff Lives, kicking it off his last day on the beach. So you guys better all enjoy his reading of Stephen Kinzer coming up. Then we got George Webb. He's still live in Slovenia, breaking down the Ukrainian-Russian conflict over in Eastern Europe. Then after that, protecting the nest at 2 p.m. with Amber Connor Tearstar and Carol McIntosh. And then we are going to do a neighborhood news hour / weekly wrap up with myself and Tyrone to end the week here. And just make sure you guys stay tuned to neighborhoodnewsstudio.com and make sure right now, it's up to you guys to share this show with one of your friends, one of your family members, just some acquaintance, someone sitting across from you on the bush. Show them the phone while you're watching the show. Let them know truth journalism still exists. All right, I'm kicking it over to John O'Loughlin to kick off the day. John, take it away.
Eek, 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 eek. Good morning, everybody. I am John O'Loughlin. Welcome to Neighborhood News Studio and my channel, McDuff Lives 3 on YouTube. It's great to be here with you once again. This is my fourth broadcast and the fourth part of my reading and comments from this book, The True Flag by Stephen Kinzer. Concentrating on this book because it enlightens us as to the real source of imperialism in the United States, and it is the same suspects, the usual suspects in my life, which is the WASPs of New England and the ancient wealth built on their trading empires, trading in anything they wanted to trade in, whatever would make them some money. And of course, that included a lot of things that we now consider to be highly immoral and wrong, but they made the money, and now they are calling the tune for the United States of America as it grows and progresses into the 19th and into the 20th centuries. So though we could look at the Dulles brothers, we can look at the Rockefellers and the Morgans and others for who's the face behind the curtain that's really running the deep state. We need to look further back in history, and that brings us back into the 1898 era, which was driven by three individuals, by Henry Cabot Lodge, the ultimate Boston Brahmin, the upper class of the upper class, the old New England wealth, combined with the incredible egotistical lunatic, as he was called, crazy. He was called absolutely insane by Mark Twain. But he was peripatetic, he was energetic, and when he got an idea, he ran with it. And this was perfect for Henry Cabot Lodge to have somebody to control, to run, to do what he wanted done. So Lodge stays behind the scenes, behind the curtain, and pushes Roosevelt out onto the public stage, where he has been busy infiltrating himself into the Department of the Navy in order to instigate a shipbuilding program so that the United States can become the empire that Lodge wants it to become. Now, the third person in this little triumvirate is none other than William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate who built his newspaper empire while Lodge is building Roosevelt's career. And so they all worked together, whether they knew it or not. The three of them were creating an irrepressible urge for empire in the United States, in the minds of the American people, in the minds of the voters. And we saw in the election of 1896, where McKinley was financed by the big money of the East for the first time, we had a election apparently bought by the incredible wealth that could be used to buy newspaper ads and control the public image of the candidates. So that while William Jennings Bryan was favored by the vast majority of people, once the public relations campaign kicked in on behalf of McKinley, the pro New England candidate, McKinley won easily. So now it's 1898, and Roosevelt has gotten insinuated into a couple of different government positions, finally making it into the Navy Department, where, as we read the last time, and if you will forgive me, I have two YouTube channels, and I try to put both of these on both channels. Unfortunately, yesterday it didn't go on to one of them, so part 3 is only available on McDuff Lives. Go to McDuff Lives 3, the original channel where I direct you to go to McDuff Lives 3. When I get home, I'll re-upload it so you have all 4 consecutive. But for now, you can find part 3 on the channel with a long name with the 7,500 subscribers. Okay, that's just housekeeping. Let's get into part 4. Now, I wanted to start off the content this morning of this book by making a jump forward in the book so that I can read to you a very important quote from Carl Schwartz, S-C-H-U-R-Z, Schwartz, who was a very important man, as important as William Jennings Bryan in his day, somebody whose name has kind of been buried out of history. But this is the title of this book comes from this quotation. So I want to emphasize that here at the beginning of our show this morning. So this is Carl Schwartz talking about the Philippines. The people of those islands will either peaceably submit to our rule or they will not. If they do not, and we must conquer them by force of arms, we shall at once have war on our hands. Now, if they resist, what shall we do? Kill them? Let soldiers marching under the stars and stripes shoot them down? Shoot them down because they stand up for their independence? Let us relax no effort in this, the greatest crisis the Republic has ever seen. Let us raise high the flag of our country, not as an emblem of reckless adventure and greedy conquest, of betrayed professions and broken pledges, of criminal aggressions and arbitrary rule over subject populations, but the old, the true flag, the flag of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, the flag of the government of, for, and by the people, the flag of national faith held sacred and of national honor unsullied, the flag of human rights and of good example to all nations, the flag of true civilization, peace, and goodwill to all men. So that's the voice coming from the opposition. Carl Schwartz, a veteran and a serious political leader of the populist movement during that time, somebody we don't remember very well, perhaps because of the influence of the narrative shaping history. Now, let's go back where we were in The True Flag, chapter 2, captioned, There May Be an Explosion. And of course, we read through the explosion in part 3 of our reading. So let's continue from there on page 37. No, just a little before that. There we are. So we talk about false flags. Now we talk about an usurpation of power within the government. You know, Henry Cabot Lodge got McKinley, against his better instincts, to allow Theodore Roosevelt to be part of the Civil Service Commission. And then, when he had an opportunity, he made him the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. That was what he wanted. Now he's the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And because the Secretary of the Navy, whose name was Long, Secretary Long, wasn't feeling well one day. He was having some back problems and unable to sleep, and so he took the day off. February 25th, 1898, takes a day off. As soon as Roosevelt realized he was alone in the office, he summoned Lodge to come, and he and Lodge sent out telegrams to all the naval commanders, basically saying, get ready for war. And if war comes, then you are to make sure that the Spanish fleet doesn't have any power to, to intervene with what we're doing. That, of course, is a nod and a wink to say you're going to destroy the Spanish fleet. Okay, so the next day, Secretary Long finds out. Quote, during my short absence, I find that Roosevelt, in his precipitate way, has come very near to causing more of an explosion than happened to the Maine, he wrote. The very devil seemed to possess him, quote unquote. Do you see what I'm saying about this concept of the triumph of the will in Nazi literature, having its forebears here in the thinking of these New England Calvinist imperialists? The very devil seemed to possess him. In other words, he took actions knowing that they were immoral, illegal, unchristian, if you will, and simply wrong because he wanted to do them. Do as thou wilt. So says Crowley. So said Lodge. Despite their displeasure, neither Long nor President McKinley countermanded Roosevelt's orders. That emboldened him. He pressed McKinley to ask Congress for a declaration of war. McKinley resisted, but agreed to submit a bill appropriating $50 million to fortify American ports and build new warships. That held off the Jingos, the pro-war people, for another week. It also provoked protests from a congressman alarmed with the rush to war. Quote, I have had letters from my people wanting to take Cuba to punish Spain, Representative David Henderson of Iowa, a leading Republican, told his colleagues. I simply write back that no international law makes the United States the regulator of the wrongs of the earth. God has written no motto on the banner of our country that demands of us the regulating of the wrongs of other countries to their people. We all sympathize with the liberty-loving and fighting Cubans, but they are citizens of another government. So long as that question is before us, I follow the advice of Washington, recommending that we mind strictly our own business. The advice of Washington from his first inaugural, of course, that reference to President George Washington and not the city of Washington. Views like these became harder to sustain as war fever intensified. They fell further out of favor after Senator Redfield Proctor, a respected Republican from Vermont, rose from his seat to hurl a new thunderbolt. Proctor had just returned from an extended tour of Cuba. Until this moment, he'd refused to say anything about what he found. His tone was calm. By one account, he read his speech, quote, with as little apparent feeling as if it constituted an agricultural report. Proctor said he had set out for Cuba, quote, with a strong conviction that the picture had been overdrawn, that a few cases of starvation and suffering had inspired and stimulated the press correspondents, and that they had given free play to a strong, natural, and highly cultivated imagination. What he found, though, was a tragic panorama of Cubans, quote, torn from their homes, many of them, quote, so diseased that they cannot be saved, their children, quote, walking around with arms and chests terribly emaciated. He called the situation in Cuba so awful that, quote, it is not within the narrow limits of my vocabulary to portray it. If the United States intervened, he concluded, these horrors would end, and, quote, bounty will reach the sufferers, unquote. Although Proctor did not say anything senators had not already heard, he was known to be close to President McKinley, and according to some reports, had cleared his speech with McKinley. This gave it special weight. Cynics growled that Proctor, who owned quarries in Vermont, was encouraging American intervention to increase the market for gravestones. Nonetheless, his speech touched many hearts. It gave expansionists their most emotionally powerful rallying cry. Businessmen favored intervention in Cuba because they wanted markets and resources. Others saw it as a strategic imperative. Now the humanitarian argument was in place. McKinley recognized its appeal. In a message to Congress on April 11th, he became the first American president to threaten war against another country because it was mistreating its own subjects. That's the key to getting the American people to support a war that we really don't have any business in. And that is to show this intolerable suffering on behalf of the victims. What more evidence do we need that this is a psychological operation against the American people to convert their minds by the use of emotional language, images, video, and staged scenes at this point? In other words, hundreds of false flags, from people like, the supposed, white, what are they in Syria? Those white helmet brigade people and others that just will fake things. Our taxpayer dollars are going to movie studios to produce fake things to fool us to give more money. This is the gift that keeps on giving if you are an imperialist, is to just have to learn how to tune in and grab a hold of the basic American conscience. And it's that conscience that people who consider themselves to be good liberals are fooled by. They've been given the images, heard the language, and, without any opposition in the media. In that day, it was Hearst. In this day, it's CNN. What's the difference, really? They're controlling people's minds who think that their minds are not under control. So not only was the imperialism movement beginning in 1890s and 1896 election, when the business people, the elites, basically purchased the election by purchasing enough ads, that the transition began to where we are now, with all the media controlled by a small number of corporations, those corporations all working together to make sure that the same message is repeated over and over and over. This media control is the one thing that our Constitution did not sufficiently address, because checks and balances is only so good as between the three departments, the three branches of government. Checks and balances does not regulate the press, and the press has a way of controlling the minds of the majority of the voters in this country. Maybe with Dominion voting machines, they don't need it anymore. But the bottom line is, basically, even with Dominion voting machines, if the people had free choices, the elections would go differently. I'm completely convinced of that. People do not see what the choices really are. So here's McKinley. Forcible intervention of the United States as a neutral to stop the war would be in the cause of humanity, and to put an end to the barbarities, bloodshed, starvation, and horrible miseries now existing there, and which the parties to the conflict are either unable or unwilling to stop or mitigate. It is no answer to say that this is all in another country, belonging to another nation, and is therefore none of our business. It is specially our duty, for it is right at our door. Unquote. So there's McKinley being convinced by the suffering that Representative Proctor reported, and the newspapers repeated, and now he, as the spokesman of our country, announces that it is our moral duty because it's right next door to us. Okay, back to Kinzer's text. Americans hate the thought of suffering anywhere. Expansionists of 1898 played to this compassion. They realized, as have their successors, that the best way to bring Americans to support a foreign intervention is to frame it as a rescue of oppressed people. Lodge did that in a long Senate speech on April 13th. He finished with a rousing call to national and racial greatness. Where does racism come from? It doesn't come from the genes of Appalachian immigrants that have children and have children's children and children's children, and somehow there's a racism gene inside of you. No, racism isn't born into you. Racism is taught and racism is learned. And while you might think, well, it's their parents, it's their community that teaches people to be racist, no. It is only the community and the parents saying it because their leaders are saying it. And when the leaders at the top of the very country appeal to racism, that's where responsibility lies. Not with the average farmer in his overalls with his gun rack. No. Racism is the responsibility of leadership. And leadership has failed us. Especially when you see this in 1898, a call to racial greatness. Well, if that's what you believe, if that's what the wealthy people of New England believe, you know, that Lodges and the Cabots and the rest of them, if that's what they believe, then this is a racist country. And let's just face it, you know, we're a country that is owned, run, controlled by a racist elite, just like the nobility of England. To say that they're not racist is to say that you don't know anything about history. You know, the whole basis of race-based slavery is tied up in the colonial status of, well, North America, but also South America, Central America. The idea that because someone is black or brown or yellow or red, that they are outside of your self-professed community of good people that obey the golden rule. And that makes them expendable, in the way, backwards. And when progress becomes more important than human rights, you need some way to divide the elites from the serfs. And what's easier than just looking at the color of someone and say, oh, you must be a slave? This is the biggest problem we're facing right now in this country, is elite people don't realize that they're racists, but they are. Their whole culture is based upon a racial division in which they get the top place. And that's McKinley. I want to read this text. This is McKinley talking on that same occasion, April 11th, 1898. We are not in this crisis by accident. We have not been brought here by chance or by clamorous politicians or by yellow journals. We are face to face with Spain today in the fulfillment of a great movement which has run through the centuries. In our veins runs the blood of Holland and the blood of England. If after all the centuries it comes to us, much as we pray to avert it, to meet Spain face to face in war, it is because we are there in obedience to a greater movement than any man can hope to control. We are there because we represent the spirit of liberty and the spirit of the new time. And Spain is over against us because she is medieval, cruel, dying. Surely there was never a more righteous cause than this for any nation to ask for justice. That gigantic murder, the last spasm of a corrupt and dying society which carried down our ship and our men, cries aloud for justice, unquote. Now that was a quote from Henry Cabot Lodge, and I apologize, I misidentified the speaker at the beginning. That whole quote was from Lodge, and you can see that that is Lodge's philosophy as carried out by Roosevelt. And Lodge, of course, you know, having his own influence. In our veins runs the blood of Holland and the blood of England. I want to think about that for a second. So Lodge is saying that he, us, we the people, represented by Lodge, are the blood descendants of English and Dutch civilization, the vanguard of civilization, the march forward of, you know, this great monumental march that's bigger than anybody and nobody can control it. It's the English and the Dutch. Who are the English and the Dutch? Well, we're talking about the English Protestants, you know, and the Dutch Protestants. The Cromwell side against the Jameses, against James I, James II, Charles I, Charles II. These are the Jacobean kings who are supplanted by the glorious revolution of 1688, and in which the natural progression, the natural heirs would have been Catholic, and therefore the people of England just said, no, we are not Catholic anymore. We don't like Catholics, and we don't want a Catholic monarch. So they passed the law of succession that said that, that you can't be any more Catholics on the throne. And through that, they were able to get William of Orange, William III, to come to England. Of course, he was married to James's daughter, Mary, James II's daughter, Mary, but she was raised as a Protestant for this very purpose. So the division of England from the papacy and the old European nobility is complete. We now are saying through Henry Cabot Lodge that we are now taking up the flag of civilization. We are now the heirs of that great Protestant revolution of 1688. That also is interesting in that, wait a minute, your ancestors came over during that time, Mr. Lodge, but look at the 19th century. Look at the 18th century. Look at, George I, George II, George III. Those are not Dutch, and they're not English. Those are Hanoverians. Those are the Germans. Why didn't you mention the Germans as part of our heritage, Mr. Lodge? Well, because you're an Anglophile, and because at that time the English nobility was feuding with the German nobility, that people didn't really identify the German nobility as part of this vanguard of civilization that the Hanoverians and the people that followed them, which we call them the Windsors now, but really they're also Germans. They come from Saxe, Coburg, Gotha, which Goth, that's the Goths, that's the Transylvanians, and all of the creepy mystery that comes with being Gothic. Well, that's not part of our heritage either, according to Henry Cabot Lodge. We're just those good old English and Dutch people that overthrew the Catholic James II. Excuse me a second. So in a way, that sets up the divisions of the 20th century. That's all I was trying to say. We are there because we represent the spirit of liberty. Yeah. Remember the great quote from the Vietnam War, we destroyed the village in order to save it. Does it make you sick to think of that? Doesn't it make you sick to think that our young men were sent out to do these things? And what they did in the Philippines is far, far worse than anybody understands yet. Yeah. Can we move forward without facing these horrors of what we did in the Philippines? Then in 1898, and then later, again and again, till you get to Ed Lansdale's fake false flag hook revolution, the HUK, the hooks. False flag. Ed Lansdale, working for the deep state, not for you and me. We're just paying for it. And then Lodge calls the explosion of the Maine, that gigantic murder, the last spasm of a corrupt and dying society, which carried down our ship and our men, cries aloud for justice. The voice of the same person that predicted the explosion himself. There may be an explosion. Well, there was an explosion. and you knew there was going to be an explosion. And now you're providing the rhetoric, the narrative to say, see, you know, it's like Fauci saying, hey, there's going to be a pandemic. And then there is a pandemic. And you say, oh, wow, that guy really had a crystal ball. He's amazing. You know, it's like, wow, McKinley, geez, Lodge, Henry Cabot Lodge, what a genius he is. He even predicted that very ship was going to get blown up. How in the heck did he do that? You know, how did Fauci know that there's going to be a pandemic during President Trump's term? How do you know that? Oh, wow, because he's the smartest guy. He's the one that should be on the Time magazine covers telling everybody, I'm the smartest guy in the world. I know everything that you need to know. So sit down, shut up, and listen. We are going to destroy the village in order to save it. We're going to destroy humanity in order to save it. We're going to destroy all the incredible diversity in order to save it, because we're the vanguard of liberty. And that's what President Biden is doing right now. He's just, if he's aware at all of what he's doing, his administration is doing it. He's claiming a moral high road, sending out messages through the controlled media, using our money in our good name, in our reputation, in our honor, to liberate people by murdering them. That's how disgusting this world is. That's how disgusting the government of this country has become. When we let those creeps run it, creeps like Henry Cabot Lodge, disgusting. This chauvinism repelled some powerful men in Washington. Among the most disgusted was the iron-willed Czar Reed, the Speaker of the House. In the weeks after the Maine exploded, he blocked bills to finance a bigger Navy. His regal scorn drove expansionist congressmen to paroxysms of anger. On the day Lodge spoke in the Senate, they jeered Reed and demanded to be heard. He ignored them. Tempers passed the breaking point. Liar, one member shouted at Reed. Scoundrel, shouted another. Pandemonium broke out. Congressmen lunged at each other. Books were thrown, including a bound volume of the Congressional Record. A stray punch knocked a House page unconscious. Women in the gallery screamed. Members rushed up and down the aisles like madmen, one newspaperman reported, exchanging hot words with clenched fists and set teeth. Excitement was at fever heat. Order was finally restored, partly by a sergeant-at-arms who charged into the scrum, swinging a wooden mace. Tempers did not cool, however. The great debate was breaking out. A couple days later, Lodge proposed an ultimatum, a Senate resolution declaring that if Spain did not withdraw from Cuba, the United States would declare war. Given the passions consuming Washington, this resolution was sure to pass. Anti-expansion senators, however, found a way to turn it to their advantage. Lodge and his companions always insisted that they wanted to fight in Cuba only to help Cubans win independence from Spain, not to annex or colonize the island. Senator Teller of Colorado took them at their word. He introduced an amendment declaring the purity of American motives and asked that it be appended to Lodge's resolution. Quote, the people of the island of Cuba are and are of a right to be free and independent, the Teller amendment said. The United States hereby disclaims any disposition or intention to exercise sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control over said island except for the pacification thereof, and asserts its determination, when that is accomplished, to leave the government and control of the island to its people, unquote. Lodge was displeased but did not resist. In the pre-dawn hours of April 19th, just think April 19th is a funny day. All the things that happened on April 19th, from Paul Revere's ride to Waco to, I mean, you name it. It's a day which I think, just the date itself must mean something to the people that plan these events. Then they passed the resolution. Spain rejected the demand that it abandon Cuba. McKinley ordered a blockade of Havana. On April 24th and 25th, Spain and the United States declared war on each other. Dissuade them, Speaker Reed fumed after one of his supporters urged him to dissuade congressmen from their aggressive course. Quote, he might as well ask me to stand out in the middle of a Kansas waste and dissuade a cyclone, unquote. In the months after the Maine exploded, Americans were gripped by a patriotic frenzy. People thrilled to the prospect of war against evil. Some, however, felt a nagging fear. American companies owned plantations, mines, and other rich properties in Cuba. Nearly all the manufactured goods sold in Cuba were imported from the United States. Congress had promised that as soon as fighting ended, American troops would withdraw from Cuba and allow Cubans to shape their own destiny. The scale of these investments led skeptics to doubt. Would the coming war really be aimed only at helping Cubans win freedom, they wondered, or would expansionists try to turn Cuba into an American territory or protectorate as soon as the Spanish were gone? More frightening, if the United States took Cuba, would it then proceed to take other lands? These were reasonable fears, but although Speaker Reed and others gave voice to them in Washington, the doubters still had no coherent national leadership. The first figure to step forward was Carl Schwartz, one of the most brilliant immigrants to the United States during the 19th century. Schwartz would go on to become a towering figure in the anti-imperialist movement, but he first made his case privately in a letter to President McKinley. Quote, it would very grievously hurt this republic in the opinion of mankind, which after all is of high importance to us. You remember Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence appealed to the opinion of mankind. If the suspicion were to grow up that the ultimate annexation of Cuba was a secret motive of our action, Schwartz wrote as the war drums began to beat, quote, such an impression cannot be too carefully guarded against. Over the course of nearly half a century in public life, Schwartz had become a unique political and moral leader. As a teenager, he fought in the 1848 revolution in his native Germany. 4 years later, he arrived in the United States, became a passionate abolitionist, and campaigned for Abraham Lincoln. He was rewarded with a post as minister to Spain. Less than a year later, he resigned, returned to the United States, joined the Union Army, was commissioned as a brigadier general, and commanded troops at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg. Later, he was elected to the United States Senate from Missouri. In 1877, President Rutherford B. Hayes named him Secretary of the Interior. He was the first immigrant from Germany to become a senator, and one of the first foreign-born cabinet secretaries. After leaving office, he spoke out regularly and wrote trenchant articles in national magazines. By one account, he became, quote, the self-constituted but exceedingly useful incarnation of our national conscience. Had it not been for his foreign birth, he might have run for president. During the stormy period between the outbreak of the Civil War and the close of the 19th century, most Americans grew familiar with the tall, erect, and vigorous figure of Carl Schwartz, known as the Dutchman, one of his biographers has written. Something about his irregular features lent itself readily to caricature, and his whiskers became as well known as Roosevelt's square teeth or Mark Twain's shaggy mustache. One of Schwartz's principles became his most famous maxim, quote, my country, right or wrong, if right, to be kept right, and if wrong, to be set right, unquote. In the matter of Cuba and the larger temptation of global power, he believed the United States was going profoundly wrong. McKinley had promised him in a letter soon after taking office in 1897, quote, "There will be no jingo nonsense under my administration," unquote. Soon afterward, McKinley told Congress that annexing any foreign land against the will of its people, quote, "would be criminal aggression." By the spring of 1898, he seemed to have changed course. Schwartz begged him to reconsider. The man who in times of popular excitement boldly and unflinchingly resists hot-tempered clamor for an unnecessary war and thus exposes himself to the opprobrious imputation of a lack of patriotism or of courage to the end of saving his country from a great calamity is, as to, quote, "loving and faithfully serving his country, at least as good a patriot as the hero of the most daring feat of arms," Schwartz wrote in Harper's soon after sending his letter to McKinley. Such noble principles may fit a peaceful era, but Americans were aflame in the spring of 1898. Schwartz's warnings were terribly timed. The United States was about to erupt in jubilant self-congratulation. Before dawn on May 1st, less than a week after the declaration of war, Admiral Dewey led 6 warships into Manila Bay and arrayed them in battle formation. Across the harbor lay the slow-moving, poorly armored Spanish fleet. By 5:20 p.m., Dewey's maneuver was complete. He gave the captain of his flagship, the USS Olympia, by 5:20 a.m., Dewey's maneuver was complete. He gave the captain of his flagship, the USS Olympia, an order that has gone down in history, quote, "You may fire when you are ready, Gridley," unquote. The barrage was devastating. When it was over, 3 Spanish ships were sunk and 6 others had been scuttled. Spain suffered 381 casualties, including 161 killed. The Americans lost no ships and had just 6 men wounded, plus 1 dead from heat stroke. All was finished by midday. Quote, "Victory, complete, glorious," was the banner headline on the next day's journal. Hearst's editorial said that this triumph proved, quote, "the right is with us and God is with the right," unquote. Yeah, Gott mit uns. Yeah. An astonishing 1.6 million papers were sold. Americans were delirious. Dewey became a hero, such as the United States had never known. The victory at Manila Bay, however, was far from complete. Dewey had destroyed the Spanish fleet, but could do no more. His ships did not carry nearly enough men to attempt an amphibious assault. Even if they had, no assault had been authorized. No one in Washington had thought about what to do next. Quote, "If old Dewey had just sailed away when he smashed that Spanish fleet," unquote, McKinley later mused, "what a lot of trouble he would have saved us." Even the nimble-minded Lodge could not immediately grasp the scope of the opportunity suddenly at hand. Quote, "The victory at Manila was at first so overwhelming that I did not take in all its possibilities," unquote. Only after a day's reflection, he recalled, that he reached his 3 conclusions. Quote, "We must on no account let the islands go. We must hold the other side of the Pacific, and the value to this country is almost beyond imagination," unquote. Later, he began imagining what that value might be. Quote, "With our protective tariff wall around the Philippine Islands," he wrote to a friend, "its 10 million inhabitants, as they advance in civilization, would have to buy our goods. And we should have so much additional market for our home manufactures." Lodge did not confess these ambitions to the public. Instead, he took advantage of his friendship with McKinley to press his case privately. The 2 men represented New England and Ohio, the twin pillars of the Republican Party. They needed each other. During that spring, Lodge haunted the White House. McKinley knew no more about the Philippines than any other American. When asked where they were, he placed them, quote, somewhere away around the other side of the world, unquote. Later, he confessed that when he received Dewey's cable announcing victory at Manila Bay, quote, I could not have told you where those darned islands were within 1,000 miles, unquote. Nor had McKinley considered what the United States might do with the Philippines after Dewey's victory. He dispatched an expeditionary force under General Wesley Merritt. And before departing, Merritt asked him in a telegram whether it is your desire to subdue and hold all of the Spanish territory in the islands, or merely to seize and hold the capital. McKinley replied vaguely that Merritt's mission would be, quote, completing the reduction of Spanish power, unquote, and giving order and security to the islands. War was approaching in Cuba, and McKinley did not want to be distracted by the Philippines. No one looked forward to this war more impatiently than Roosevelt. On May the 6th, as he had promised, he quit his job as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and announced that he was ready to fight in Cuba. Secretary Long wrote in his diary that Roosevelt's unbounded energy and force had clouded his judgment. Quote, he has lost his head to this unutterable folly of deserting his post where he is of most service and running off to ride a horse and probably brush mosquitoes off his neck on the Florida sands. Long wrote, his heart is right and he means well, but it is one of those cases of aberration, desertion, vainglory, of which he is utterly unaware. He thinks he is following his highest ideal. Whereas, in fact, as without exception every one of his friends advises him, he is acting like a fool. And yet, Lodge added as an afterthought, quote, how absurd this will sound if by some turn of fortune he should accomplish some great thing. Roosevelt believed he had the makings of an ideal soldier. Few agreed. He applied to join the staff of General Fitzhugh Lee, a former consul general in Havana, but Lee would not have him. Just make a note of that name, Fitzhugh Lee, right? That was the Lees of Fredericksburg, the Lees of Robert E. Lee's heritage. And Fitzhugh, of course, is also one of those colonial names from the upper classes in the 1700s, Fitzhugh Lee. So that, in other words, this is the Confederate side, racist side of the reconstituted U.S. Army, which really was a combination of the Union and the Confederate armies. You know, it just occurred to me that when you're thinking of Reinhard Gehlen, you know, and how his intelligence operation became the American intelligence operation in Germany and Eastern Europe, how the same principles were applied there, where they're now part of us. Regiments were being organized by state, and Roosevelt asked the governors of New York and Massachusetts to commission him. Both refused. Finally, his friend and fellow expansionist, Colonel Leonard Wood, persuaded the territorial governor of Arizona to commission Roosevelt as a lieutenant colonel. He was ordered to proceed to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, and raise a cavalry unit. Officially, he was second in command under Wood, but the public saw only him. According to one newspaper, quote, Colonel Wood is lost sight of entirely in the effulgence of Teethador. Teethador. I now know that I would have turned from my wife's deathbed to have answered the call, Roosevelt told a friend. This war gave him, he said, quote, my chance to cut my little notch on the stick that stands as a measuring rod in every family, unquote. Some of the men who turned up to fight along Roosevelt were cowboys used to hard work and punishing heat. To join them, Roosevelt recruited a pack of Eastern swells from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and many other colleges, from clubs like the Somerset of Boston and the Knickerbocker of New York, and from among men who belonged to neither club nor college, but in whose veins the blood stirred with the same impulse which once sent the Vikings overseas. They found each other odd but invigorating company. One wrote that his comrades included millionaires, paupers, shyster lawyers, cowboys, quack doctors, farmers, college professors, miners, adventurers, preachers, prospectors, socialists, journalists, insurance agents, Jews, politicians, Gentiles, Mexicans, professed Christians, Indians, West Point graduates, Arkansas wild men, baseball players, sheriffs, and horse thieves. I find also a great deal of interesting resonance between Theodore Roosevelt recruiting the Ivy League intellectuals to blend them with the cowboy mentality of the Texas contingent, to be almost the same idea as the formation of the OSS and the CIA, as you know, the OSS, oh so social. These intellectually conceited people that think that they know more about the world than everyone else want to get the notch in their gun. They want to have a certification that they were real warriors, that they did things. But they didn't have to actually, join the regular army and work their way up through the ranks. No, they got just, boom, you're a Rough Rider. Boom, you're in the OSS. Well, this idea of elite privilege and the idea of the elite privileged ones carrying the flag of liberty up San Juan Hill while they're shooting these poor people that are trying to get away, shooting them in the back. It's not my idea of patriotism. And I don't think that that's the patriotism that is represented by the true flag, the flag of the United States, the flag of Abraham Lincoln and George Washington and the patriots of this country. So we need to take it back. And I can't think of a better way to do that than just stick right here on Neighborhood News Studio for the rest of the day and enjoy the programming, participate, join the chat, and do as Andy says, share this link with your friends and family. All right, I'll turn it back over to Andy and the studio, and everybody else. Have a great weekend. I will see you Monday morning. Bye now.
They have been sorry, I think I was muted right there. Actually, I got a knock on the wall. Thank you, John, once again for the great week here, and we're working with some new equipment here. we're trying to go wireless, ladies and gentlemen. My bad. But thank you, John, once again for the great week here at Neighborhood News Studio. You can catch up to John and all of his work at screamingospreys.com. As you can see, the ospreys are out of the nest. They're nourishing themselves. So they're flying around. Mom and dad aren't just keeping as close an eye on them anymore. And that's what we intend to do to other citizen journalists here at Neighborhood News Studio as well. So go sign up for that journal club at neighborhoodnewsstudio.com. You can find all of John's archived work at Screaming Ospreys. He has a continuous live stream of all his past shows Some may call it programming. Don't. If you're an actual TV station, but it is a lot of great interviews, great book readings, and a lot of great research being done by John at screamingaspreys.com. And make sure you pick up the book he wrote about his dad, Macduff Lives, The Life and Untimely Death of Thomas F. O'Loughlin Jr. All available at screamingaspreys.com. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to move ahead with the schedule. Our next journalist, we're waiting for the big guy, George Webb, to be joining us here shortly. So everyone at everyone at Macduff Lives, make sure you go to neighborhoodnewsstudio.com right now. We're giving you the boot off the stream. So go to neighborhoodnewsstudio.com to continue